The Sears catalog hit the kitchen table like a judge's gavel. Page 847. International Harvester 1086 with factory cab, air conditioning, AM/FM radio, padded seat, soundproofing. $24,500. Brad Sorensen's finger was still on the picture when his father walked in from the barn. We're not buying a living room on wheels. Marvin Sorensen didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. 38 years farming the same 1,280 acres in Walworth County, South Dakota, and he'd never said something twice when once was enough. Brad was 24. College AG degree from Brookings. 2 years back on the farm. 2 years of watching his father do things the way they'd always been done. 2 years of biting his tongue. This morning, the tongue wasn't biting anymore. That 1086 would pull the 24-foot chisel plow in half the time the 806 does. We could work twice the acres per day, which means we finish before the weather turns, which means you want to sit in an air-conditioned cab while the work gets done. Marvin poured coffee. I put in 60 acres yesterday on the 806. Same tractor you're too good for. Explain to me why you can't. Because I'm losing hearing in my left ear. That stopped Marvin's hand halfway to his mouth. Doc Henderson checked it last month. 70 hours a week on open tractors. The engine noise is cumulative. Dad, I'm 24 and I've already got hearing loss. By 40 you'll be tough enough to handle it. Marvin set the cup down. Your grandfather worked the field with horses. You think he complained about engine noise? Grandfather died at 56. The kitchen went quiet. Outside, the wind pushed against the window, like it was testing for weakness. March in South Dakota meant the ground was thawing, but winter wasn't done with you yet. Brad could see the 806 sitting in the yard, the same tractor he'd been running since high school. Red paint faded to primer patches. No cab, no radio, no insulation between a man and the elements. Just a seat, a steering wheel, and the kind of exposure that people born in 1910 considered character building. Before I go further, you need to understand what was happening in American agriculture in 1977. According to USDA census data, the average age of American farmers had crossed 53 for the first time. The generation that had farmed through the Depression, through the war, through the lean years of the 50s. They were approaching retirement age, but they weren't retiring. They were holding on. And the sons who'd gone to AG college, who'd learned about efficiency ratios and soil science and equipment depreciation schedules, they were coming back to farms that operated like it was still 1955. The tractor cab wasn't a luxury item anymore. By 1977, nearly 40% of new tractors sold came with factory cabs as standard equipment. International Harvester's Control Center cab offered sound insulation that reduced engine noise by 20 decibels. John Deere's SoundGuard cab advertised office quiet comfort. These weren't selling points aimed at soft people. They were engineering solutions to real problems: hearing loss, heat exhaustion, dust inhalation, and the simple fact that a comfortable operator makes fewer mistakes during a 16-hour day. But to Marvin Sorensen's generation, comfort and weakness were the same word. Your grandfather, Marvin said slowly, died from a heart that gave out because he worked hard his entire life, not because he was on a tractor without a cab. Don't make his sacrifices sound like mistakes. I'm not. You want to know what I did when I was 24? Marvin wasn't asking. I was farming with equipment held together by baling wire and prayer. No bank loans because there was nothing to borrow against. 3 years of drought that left this country looking like the Dust Bowl came back. And I made it work. You know how? By doing what needed to be done, not by asking for air conditioning. Brad stared at the catalog page. The numbers were right there. The 1086 with cab, 105 horsepower, 540 PTO, 8-speed transmission, 3-point hitch capacity of 6,500 pounds. Operating cost per hour, accounting for fuel and maintenance, $8.40. The 806 they currently owned, 80 horsepower, constant repairs, fuel consumption that made diesel dealers smile. Operating cost per hour, $7.20. The difference looked small until you multiplied it across 600 hours of spring field work. The cab tractor pays for itself in 5 years through efficiency gains alone, Brad said. I ran the numbers. You ran numbers. I ran a farm. Marvin stood. Tell you what I'll do. You want something for your head while you're working? I'll buy you a hat. 3 days later, a John Deere had arrived in the mail. Green and yellow. Meshback. Marvin set it on Brad's bed without comment. Brad wore it the next morning when he fired up the 806 at 6 a.m. to start pre-planning the North Quarter. The hat kept the sun off. Didn't do much of the engine roar that made his ears ring by noon. Didn't keep the dust out of his lungs when the wind shifted. Didn't insulate him when the temperature dropped 15 degrees. By evening, and he was still 3 hours from finishing. He wore the hat every day that week. Marvin watched from the kitchen window and nodded like a point had been made. What neither of them understood yet was that spring of 77 was going to force the issue in ways no argument could. The trouble started in April, not dramatic trouble, the kind that creeps up through small failures that compound. The 806 threw a hydraulic line on April 12th. Brad patched it. 2 days later, the same line blew again, this time taking half a day to source the part from Mobridge. On April 18th, the clutch started slipping during heavy pulls. Marvin said to baby it through planting season. They'd rebuild it in June. Brad babied it. The clutch disagreed and gave up entirely on April 24th, leaving Brad stuck in the middle of the south field with 60 acres left to disc before the rain came. They rented a tractor from Hendrickson's place. Smaller than the 806. Slower. Brad lost 2 days making up the work. May came in wet. Not enough to stop planting, but enough to make everything harder. The fields that should have been finished in 8 days took 12. Marvin ran the old John Deere 4020. Brad stayed on the patch together 806, and both of them worked from dawn until the dew got too heavy to continue. By mid-May, they were behind schedule, and the long-range forecast showed a dry spell coming in June. We plant now or we miss the window, Marvin said at dinner. Weather changes next week. We'll be lucky to finish by Memorial Day. Brad looked at his plate. The 1086 is still available. We're not buying a tractor. We're losing money every day we're delayed. We're losing money if we take on $24,000 in debt. Dad, the interest rate right now is 7.8% through PCA. By this time next year, it'll be 9%. Probably higher. If we're going to finance equipment, now is the time. Marvin set his fork down. You think I don't know what interest rates are doing? I've been watching them since Nixon took us off gold. I watched them through the oil embargo. I know exactly what they're doing. And I know that debt is how farmers lose their land. Debt is also how farmers grow. Debt is how farmers go under. Marvin's voice stayed level, but something in it had sharpened. You read about it in your college books. I watched it happen to real people. Henderson's place across the county line, gone in 75. Mortgage heavy to expand, bought new equipment. Grain prices dropped, couldn't make payments. Bank took everything. His grandfather homesteaded that land in 1883. 3 generations of Hendersons. Gone because someone thought debt was how you grow. Henderson made bad decisions with his debt. Buying equipment isn't the same as speculating on. All debt is speculation. You're betting you can pay it back. Sometimes you're wrong. Brad pushed back from the table. I'm going to check the fields. He wore the John Deere hat. The irony wasn't lost on him. The conflict that happens between fathers and sons on farms is different from other family arguments. In town, if you disagree with your father, you go to your apartment. You have distance. On a farm, you wake up in the same house, eat breakfast at the same table, work the same ground, and go to bed knowing tomorrow you'll do it all again. The disagreement doesn't get resolved. It gets managed, day after day after day. Brad managed it by working harder, up earlier, staying later, taking on the jobs Marvin didn't ask him to do. If he couldn't get the cab tractor, he'd prove he didn't need it. He'd show his father that he was tough enough, committed enough, worthy of being called a farmer by the old man standards. By June, Brad looked like someone who'd been managing a disagreement too hard for too long. On June 8th, everything changed. Carl Wojcik ran 2,400 acres, 3 miles north of the Sorensen place. Bigger operation, more equipment, more debt. Carl had bought an International 1486 with cab 2 years earlier and made no secret about loving it. Marvin dismissed Carl as someone who'd regret those decisions when times got tight. Carl collapsed in his field on June 8th at 2:30 in the afternoon. Heat exhaustion. Temperature had hit 97 degrees. He'd been running a disc without a cab for 9 hours straight, trying to finish before rain came. His hired man found him passed out next to the tractor, severely dehydrated, heart rate over 140. County ambulance took 40 minutes to reach the field. Carl spent 3 days in the hospital in Aberdeen. Word spread fast. At the grain elevator on June 11th, Marvin heard the whole story from Harold Jensen, who'd heard it from Carl's wife. Harold didn't editorialize. Didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. Marvin came home quiet. That evening, Brad was changing oil on the 4020 when Marvin walked into the shed, heard about Carl Wojcik. Yeah, Brad didn't look up. Heard he's going to be okay. Heard it was heat exhaustion. Heard that, too. Marvin watched Brad work for a minute. You ever feel like you're going to pass out during a long day? Brad set the wrench down, looked at his father. Every week. Why didn't you say something? Because you'd tell me to drink more water and toughen up. Marvin's jaw worked like he was chewing on words he wasn't ready to spit out. Finally, Carl's 56 years old, been farming since he could walk. Tough as they come. And heat put him in the hospital. I know. You're 24. I know. Marvin turned to leave, stopped, turned back. That 1086. Still available? Brad's hands had gone still. You asking? I'm asking what the actual numbers are. No arguing. Just show me what you calculated. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours that night. Brad had a spiral notebook filled with calculations he'd been refining for 6 months. He walked Marvin through every number. Purchase price, interest calculations, fuel efficiency gains, time savings, the reduced operator fatigue translated to fewer mistakes, maintenance costs, depreciation schedules, resale value, the whole analysis. Marvin listened without interrupting. When Brad finished, Marvin stared at the notebook for a long time. The 5-year payback he calculated. That assumes commodity prices stay where they are. It assumes corn at $2.10 and wheat at $2.40. If prices go up, payback is faster. If they drop below $1.90 and $2.20 respectively, it extends to 6 years. And you think prices hold? I think Soviet demand stays strong. I think export numbers support current price levels. But no, I don't know. Nobody knows. Marvin nodded slowly. At least you're honest about it. Dad, even if we're conservative and say 7-year payback, the efficiency gains alone justify. I'm not arguing. Marvin closed a notebook. I'm thinking. That was June 11th. For 3 days, Marvin said nothing more about it. Brad went back to running the 806 with the John Deere hat and tried not to hope. On June 14th, Marvin drove to the International Harvester dealer in Mobridge. Brad was disking the West Quarter when he saw his father's truck coming back down the section road. Behind the truck, on a lowboy trailer, was a red tractor with a cab. Brad shut down the 806, climbed off, stood there with dust coating his jeans and the John Deere hat tilted back on his head, and watched the trailer turn into their yard. Marvin got out of the truck. It's not the 1086, he called across the distance. Dealer had a 76 1066 with cab, low hours, farm trade-in. Saved us $6,000. Figured that puts the payback closer to 4 years. Brad walked over. The 1066 sat on the trailer, like a promise kept. Factory cab, air conditioning, sound guard insulation. 404 cubic inch engine, 101 horsepower. Everything he'd wanted, minus the newest model's upgrades. The compromise was so reasonable it hurt. What changed your mind? Brad asked. Marvin was quiet for a moment. Carl Wojcik's a stubborn son of a bitch. Tougher than me, if I'm being honest. If the heat could put him down, it could put any of us down. I got no interest in proving I'm tougher than the sun. He paused. And maybe I've been farming like it's still 1950 when it's 1977. Maybe that makes me stubborn. Maybe it makes me stupid. It makes you careful. Careful doesn't put food on the table if you're too broken down to farm. Marvin looked at his son. You were right about the numbers. The cab pays for itself. I was being stubborn about something that didn't matter. It mattered to you. Yeah, well, Marvin almost smiled. I'm allowed to be wrong. They spent the next hour unloading the 1066. Marvin handled the trailer chains while Brad fired up the tractor for the first time. The engine turned over smooth. The cab sealed out the wind. The seat had suspension that absorbed the ground shock. The sound insulation cut the engine roar to a manageable hum. Brad could hear himself think. He looked through the cab glass at his father, who was coiling the chains on the trailer. Marvin glanced up, caught his son watching, and nodded once. Brad nodded back. The John Deere had sat on the dash. Brad left it there. Now, here's the thing about that moment. The thing you won't find in the equipment manuals or the USDA efficiency studies. The 1066 with cab represented more than sound insulation and operator comfort. It represented a father admitting he didn't have all the answers. It represented a son proving his analysis without having to prove his toughness. It represented the negotiation that happens in every generation when the old way meets the new way, and somehow they find a path forward that neither one expected. The decision Marvin made on June 14th, 1977 had ripples. Let me show you what they looked like. By harvest that fall, the 1066 had logged 480 hours. Brad ran it for the wheat harvest in July, the soybean harvest in September. The cab meant he could work longer days without the cumulative fatigue that led to mistakes. The air conditioning meant he stayed hydrated and alert even during the August heat waves that pushed temperatures above 100 degrees for 6 straight days. The sound insulation meant his hearing loss stopped progressing. Doc Henderson confirmed this at his annual checkup in October. The efficiency gains Brad had calculated turned out to be conservative. The 1066 pulled their implements 15% faster than the old 806, not 10%. Fuel consumption per acre worked was 8% better than projected. By November, when Marvin sat down with the year-end books, the payback timeline had shortened to 3.7 years. But the real impact wasn't in the spreadsheet numbers. In August, during a particularly brutal heat wave, Marvin ran the 1066 for the first time. Brad was combining wheat. So Marvin took the 1066 to finish disking the south quarter before the forecasted rain. He climbed into the cab at 6 a.m., closed the door, started the engine, reached over and turned on the air conditioning. He ran for 8 hours straight. When he finished, he climbed down from the cab and walked into the house where Brad was eating a late lunch. That cab, Marvin said, is the best investment we've made in 10 years. Brad looked up. Yeah, my back doesn't hurt. My ears aren't ringing. I can think. Marvin poured himself coffee. I spent 38 years proving I was tough enough to handle open cab tractors. Turns out I was just being stubborn. You were doing what you thought was right. Same thing sometimes. Marvin sat down. But I'm glad you pushed. You were right. I was wrong. That's worth saying out loud. You didn't have to buy it, Dad. You could have kept saying no. Could have. But then what? You keep driving equipment that's damaging your hearing? You collapse from heat exhaustion like Carl? I keep insisting the old way is the only way until you get fed up and go farm somewhere else. Marvin shook his head. I'm stubborn, not stupid. You made your case. The numbers backed it up. I listened. That's what partnership looks like. Partnership. Marvin had never used that word before. That fall, other changes followed. Small ones. Together they sat down and planned equipment purchases for the next 3 years. Together they redesigned the crop rotation to take advantage of current market demands. Together they attended an AG economic seminar in Pierre, where speakers discussed the coming changes in agriculture. The consolidation, the technology, the shift from survival farming to business management. Marvin listened, took notes, asked questions. At Christmas dinner, Marvin's brother commented on the new tractor. Heard you finally went soft and got a cab tractor. Marvin didn't miss a beat. Heard you finally went broke and had to sell off the North Quarter, Tom. Tom's face went red. That's different. Yeah, it is. I bought equipment that keeps my operation running efficiently. You bought land you couldn't afford to work. Which one of us went soft? The table went quiet. Then Marvin's sister-in-law laughed, and the tension broke. After dinner, Brad found his father standing by the window, looking out at the yard where the 1066 sat parked next to the old 806. Thanks for backing me up in there, Brad said. Wasn't backing you up, was stating facts. Marvin turned from the window. Tom's been giving me shit about being behind the times for 20 years. Feels good to be ahead of him for once. We're ahead of him? He's selling land to make payments. We're buying equipment that increases productivity. Yeah, we're ahead of him. Brad looked at his father. You ever going to admit you were wrong about the cab? Just did. Back in August. You weren't listening. I was listening. I'm checking if you were serious. Marvin smiled. Actually smiled. Get out of here. Go be young somewhere. Brad wore the John Deere hat to the New Year's dance at the Grange Hall, partly because it had become comfortable, partly because it reminded him of the summer his father bought him a hat instead of a tractor, and how that particular piece of stubbornness had eventually bent into something better. Now, let me give you the update on what happened next, because the story didn't end with a tractor purchase and a father-son reconciliation. That's not how farming works. By 1979, interest rates had climbed to 15%. The debt Marvin had been so careful to avoid became the reality for thousands of farmers who'd expanded during the boom years of the mid-70s. The Sorensen operation, because of Marvin's caution and Brad's efficiency calculations, was positioned better than most. They'd financed the 1066 at 7.8%. They'd paid it down aggressively. By the time interest rates spiked, they had options. In 1980, when Tom Sorensen finally lost a farm he'd been desperately trying to save, Marvin and Brad bought his North Quarter at auction. Fair price. They helped Tom move his equipment. They didn't gloat. The 1066 ran until 1989, when Brad, now fully partnered with his father, traded it in on a newer model with even more technology. By then, Marvin was 63. He still farmed, but Brad handled more of the day-to-day decisions. The partnership they'd forged in 1977 had evolved into something neither of them had expected: genuine respect. Marvin passed away in 1994. Heart attack. Quick. He was in the shop, working on a hydraulic line. Brad found him there. At the funeral, Brad wore the John Deere hat. It seemed right. The hat is framed now, hanging in Brad's office. His own son, Marvin's grandson, asked about it once. Why'd you keep an old hat? Brad thought about how to explain. Your grandfather bought me that hat instead of a tractor I wanted. It was his way of saying I wasn't tough enough. Turned out it was his way of testing whether I'd keep pushing for what I knew was right. Did you? I did. And he listened. Eventually. Brad looked at the framed hat. That's what the hat reminds me of, not the disagreement. The listening. Here's what I want you to understand about this story. It's easy to make it about a tractor, about a father being stubborn and a son being modern, about old ways versus new ways. But that's not what it was really about. It was about two people who cared about the same thing: the land, the farm, the future, trying to figure out how to move forward when they disagreed about the path. It was about a father learning to trust his son's education without dismissing his own experience. It was about a son learning to present his case without dismissing his father's wisdom. It was about the moment when stubbornness bends just enough to let something better emerge. The cab tractor was just a vehicle for that lesson. Literally. In 1977, American agriculture was standing at a crossroads. The old generation that had farmed through every kind of hardship was getting older. The new generation that had been educated in agribusiness and efficiency was coming back to the land. The question wasn't whether change would happen. The question was whether the transition would tear families apart or bring them together. For Marvin and Brad Sorensen, it brought them together. The tractor helped. But the real work happened in that kitchen, at that table, when a father decided to look at his son's numbers and a son decided his father's caution had value, when stubbornness bent just enough to let wisdom from both directions find a path forward. That's the story. A son wanted a cab tractor. A father bought him a hat. And somehow, between the gesture and the grudge, they found their way to partnership. If you lived through this era, if you remember the argument about equipment, about debt, about whether the old ways still worked in a changing world, I want to hear about it. What was the moment things changed on your farm? What was the compromise that made the difference? Tell me in the comments. And if you think these stories matter, if you believe agricultural history is worth preserving not as mythology but as a complicated human reality it actually was, then subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to understand that every generation has to figure out how to honor the past while building the future. That's not easy work. It never has been. The John Deere hat is framed on the wall. The 1066 is long gone, replaced by technology Marvin couldn't have imagined. But the lesson both pieces of equipment taught, about listening, about flexibility, about finding the path forward even when you disagree, that lesson is still running, still relevant, still worth remembering. That's the story of the summer a father bought his son a hat instead of tractor, and how a family figured out what really mattered.